The images are now part of our daily lives. Desperate families wading through a muddy river, political ads showing endless lines of people, heated debates about walls, asylum, and a system everyone agrees is broken. The U.S.-Mexico border is the American political crisis of the 21st century. It's a 2,000-mile stage for human drama and political theater, a place that feels permanently on the verge of collapse. We argue endlessly about how to manage the line, how to secure it, who should be allowed to cross it. But here's the problem with that debate. We're so focused on the symptoms that we've forgotten the cause. We're arguing about a fever without asking about the infection. The real question isn't how to control the border, it's why the border is even there. Why does this specific line on a map, a line that follows a river, then cuts across a desert, cleave a continent in two, and generate so much conflict? To understand today's headlines, you can't start with modern politics. You have to go back to a forgotten war and a single document that redefined a continent. This is the story of how the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo imposed a rigid, artificial political border onto a landscape where people, culture, and money had flowed freely for centuries. This is why our modern immigration crisis exists. The treaty didn't just end a war, it created the very concept of the illegal immigrant in this region by criminalizing patterns of movement that were older than the United States itself. It was a geopolitical earthquake that instantly transformed established communities into a dispossessed ethnic minority, turning citizens into foreigners without them ever moving an inch. To uncover this history is to trace the scar of a forgotten war. We will see how a calculated obsession in the White House, fueled by a powerful and dangerous idea, led to an invasion. We will see how a treaty signed under duress drew a line on a map that ignored the human reality on the ground. And finally, we will see how that line, over the next 175 years, hardened from a simple demarcation into the fortified wall we know today. This isn't just a story about a border, it's the story of how that border created the world we're stuck with. To understand the war that created the border, you first have to understand the idea that made the war possible. In the early 1840s, the United States was a nation seething with ambition. It was young, aggressive, and convinced of its own unique virtue. But this ambition lacked a unifying theory, a grand slogan to justify its explosive growth. It needed a mission. That mission was given its name by a man named John O'Sullivan, an influential magazine editor and political operative in New York. O'Sullivan wasn't a general or a president, but his contribution was strategically more powerful than an army. He was a master propagandist, and he saw that American expansion needed better marketing. Taking land from Mexico or Britain sounded like simple theft. It needed to sound like destiny. This is why, in 1845, he coined a phrase that would change history: manifest destiny. It was a simple idea with profound consequences. Manifest destiny was the belief that God Himself had chosen the United States to spread its democratic and Protestant values across the entire North American continent. It was a political permission slip, divinely signed. The concept strategically reframed conquest as a righteous, even holy act. It wasn't about greed for land, it was about fulfilling a preordained, God-given mission. Because of this powerful new ideology, American expansion was no longer a debatable policy. It was a foregone conclusion. The idea spread like wildfire, infecting Congress, the press, and the public. It provided the moral and political cover for what was to come. With manifest destiny as its guide, the nation's leaders no longer had to ask if they should expand. The only question left was how far, how fast, and who stood in their way. And their eyes turned south, to the vast, rich, and vulnerable territories of their neighbor, the Republic of Mexico. An idea like manifest destiny is powerful, but it's also an abstraction. To become a reality, it needs an engine. It needs a man willing to stake his entire legacy on turning a slogan into a map. That man was James K. Polk. Elected president in 1844, Polk was not a charismatic visionary. He was a cold, methodical, and intensely ambitious politician who promised to serve only one term. Because of this self-imposed deadline, he was a man in a hurry. His singular obsession was to fulfill America's destiny by acquiring the vast Mexican territories of California and New Mexico. This wasn't a vague hope, it was a 4-year plan. This is the moment when a national mood becomes a presidential policy. Polk's strategy was direct. First, he would try to buy the land. He dispatched a diplomat, John Slidell, to Mexico City with a secret offer to purchase the territory for up to $30 million. But Mexico, politically unstable and deeply insulted by the recent U.S. annexation of Texas, refused to even meet with him. For Polk, however, this diplomatic rejection wasn't a setback. It was a crucial part of his plan. His calculus was simple. If Mexico wouldn't sell, he would provoke a conflict and take the land by force. He had already set the pieces in motion. Polk's personal ambition is the critical link between a popular ideology and the war that created the modern border. He transformed a divine mission into a military timetable, setting the stage for a confrontation he saw as both necessary and inevitable. The only thing he needed now was an excuse. Because his offer to buy the territory was rejected, President Polk needed a casus belli, a justification for war, and he knew just where to create one. The problem, and for Polk the solution, was a desolate 150-mile-wide stretch of land between two rivers in South Texas. The newly annexed state of Texas claimed its southern border was the Rio Grande. Mexico, however, had always maintained the border was the Nueces River, far to the north. This disputed territory, known as the Nueces Strip, was Polk's chessboard. This is how a border dispute becomes a deliberate provocation. In January 1846, Polk made a calculated move. He ordered General Zachary Taylor to march his Army of Observation south across the Nueces River and into the contested land. Taylor's orders were to advance all the way to the Rio Grande and establish a fort directly across from the Mexican city of Matamoros. It was an unambiguous act of aggression. Taylor was planting the American flag on soil that Mexico considered its own. For weeks, the two armies stared at each other across the river in a tense standoff. Taylor even blockaded the river, cutting off supplies to the Mexican troops. Finally, on April 25, 1846, the Mexican army responded as Polk knew they must. A cavalry unit crossed the Rio Grande and ambushed an American patrol. 16 American soldiers were killed or wounded. This was the moment Polk had engineered. He now had his incident. He could go before Congress and declare, with calculated outrage, that Mexico had shed American blood upon the American soil. The war had begun, not as a defense, but as a trap, and it had been sprung. With American bloodshed, President Polk had the justification he needed. He declared a swift, righteous war to defend American honor. But this is the moment when a single event splits into two irreconcilable stories. Because of this, the border wasn't just born of conflict, but of competing truths that have never been resolved. For most Americans, the war was a validation of manifest destiny. It was sold as a mission to spread liberty to a backward people, a necessary response to Mexican aggression. But for Mexico, this was simply an invasion. They called it La Invasión Estadounidense, the American invasion. Leading the Mexican resistance was the formidable and often contradictory Antonio López de Santa Anna. He framed the war not as a border dispute, but a fight for national survival against an expansionist slave power. He knew the United States' victory would mean the extension of slavery, a practice Mexico had abolished decades earlier. This is why, from the very beginning, the conflict was seen in starkly different moral terms. The American story was of liberation. The Mexican story was of a land grab for slavery. And this wasn't just a Mexican perspective. Inside the United States, a vocal minority saw the war for what it was. A young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln challenged Polk on the floor of the House, demanding he show the exact spot where American blood was shed on American soil. This dissent reveals the critical truth. The war and the border it would create were controversial from their inception. It was never a universally celebrated cause, but a calculated political act whose legitimacy was questioned from day one. The war was a brutal, one-sided affair. After the U.S. Army captured Mexico City, the fighting was over. But here's the problem. Winning the war is easy. Winning the peace is hard. This is how the line on the map we know today was drawn not by a grand design, but by a defiant act of insubordination. President Polk sent a diplomat, Nicholas Trist, to negotiate the terms. Trist's instructions were simple: get California and New Mexico and establish the Rio Grande as the border. But as the victories piled up, Polk's ambition grew. He began to wonder, why not take more? Why not all of Mexico? Believing Trist was too soft, Polk sent a letter recalling him to Washington. The message was clear. The negotiations were off. Polk wanted to escalate. But the letter was delayed. By the time Trist received his orders to come home, he was on the verge of a deal. He faced a monumental choice: obey his president and allow the war to continue, or defy him and secure the peace he believed was right. In a calculated act of disobedience, Trist wrote a 65-page letter back to Polk explaining why he was ignoring the recall. He decided, as a private citizen with no authority, to finish the job. On February 2, 1848, he signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This treaty ended the war and officially drew the line. It ceded over half of Mexico's territory to the United States. Because of Trist's defiance, a fluid cultural region was severed by a rigid political boundary, instantly transforming centuries of movement into a question of legal and illegal. Because of Trist's defiance, the line was drawn. But what happens when a border moves and the people don't? Overnight, some 100,000 Mexican citizens in California, New Mexico, Texas found themselves living in a new country. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo tried to address this. Article 9 was a promise, a guarantee that these people could either remain Mexican citizens or become full U.S. citizens with all the rights to their property, liberty, and religion. On paper, it was a shield. In reality, it was a target. This is how a promise of inclusion became a mechanism of dispossession. Anglo-American lawyers, speculators, and settlers saw not new countrymen, but obstacles sitting on valuable land. They used the American legal system as a weapon. Suddenly, Spanish land grants, some centuries old, had to be proven in English-speaking courts. Unfamiliar with the new laws and often unable to afford lawyers, landowners lost their property through litigation, debt, or outright fraud. A new system of property taxes, which didn't exist under Mexican law, forced many more into foreclosure. This wasn't an accident. It was a calculated transfer of wealth and power. The promise of citizenship was technically kept, but their property, the basis of their economic and political power, was systematically stripped away. This created the foundational grievance of the borderlands. A population made foreigners in their own homes, transformed into a landless, politically marginalized minority. This dispossession created a permanent underclass. But for decades, the line itself remained porous, little more than a suggestion on a map. People, families, and workers continued to move back and forth, following seasons and opportunities just as their ancestors had for centuries. The movement was normal. The border was an abstraction. So how did this chalk line become a concrete wall? The answer lies not in Mexico, but in Washington, D.C. As the United States lurched through economic busts at the turn of the 20th century, politicians needed a simple answer for a complex problem. This is when they discovered the strategic power of immigration law. First came the Chinese Exclusion Act, then literacy tests, then national quotas, all designed to control the flow of labor and engineer the country's demographics. These laws were not initially aimed at the southern border, but they established a new, powerful idea that movement across a border was not a natural right, but a privilege granted or denied by the state. This led directly to the creation of the U.S. Border Patrol in 1924. For the first time, armed federal agents were tasked with policing the line. Suddenly, the age-old practice of walking from Chihuahua to Texas to find work was transformed from a routine into a crime. The concept of the illegal alien was born, not from a change in human behavior, but from a change in American law. The border had been given teeth. This is why the border remains an open wound in the American consciousness. The legal machinery invented in the early 20th century, the Border Patrol, the concept of the illegal alien, gave the United States a powerful tool to manage the consequences of its own conquest. It allowed politicians to turn a historical reality into a law enforcement problem. And for 100 years, that is how the story has been told. A simple drama of law and order, of us versus them, played out on a defensive line under constant threat. But here is the fundamental truth, the hidden mechanism driving a century of conflict. The U.S.-Mexico border was never designed for defense. It was forged for acquisition. James K. Polk and his allies didn't draw a line on a map to protect a nation. They drew it to enlarge one. The goal was not to keep people out, but to lock newly conquered land, resources, and people in. We debate the border today as if it's a shield, but it was born as a sword, a strategic instrument of territorial expansion. This is the original sin that haunts every modern policy debate. Because the border's purpose was conquest, every subsequent action has been about managing that conquest. The dispossession of Mexican landowners wasn't an unfortunate side effect, it was necessary to consolidate the prize. The creation of a marginalized, Spanish-speaking underclass wasn't an accident. It was the direct result of transforming citizens into foreigners overnight. The criminalization of migration wasn't about security. It was about controlling the cross-border labor force that the conquest itself had created. The system isn't broken. It is doing what it was designed to do. So when we see the crisis at the border today, we are not witnessing a new invasion. We are watching the long, painful echo of a forgotten war. The line drawn in the sand by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was more than a border. It was a scar that divided families, severed economic lifelines, and criminalized patterns of life that were centuries old. The conflict we see in the headlines is not a failure of walls or policies. It is the unresolved legacy of an empire that acquired a population and a geography it never fully understood. It is the ghost of a war that the United States won but never truly came to terms with. If this history changed how you see the headlines, hit subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden wiring of our world. And leave a comment below. What part of this story were you never taught in school?